Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, and we had some balance changes on Tuesday for reset as well. So it's time again to check in on the DPS rankings for all DPS specs in Dragonflight. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. So like we do every week, we're going to check in with the performance and the overall scoring for each DPS spec in Heroic, Mythic, and Mythic Plus. We'll start. This is not this week's data. This is the data that I pulled last week. It is pulled from Warcraft logs, from the parses. It is using all percentiles. So it's the overall raw data of just how the specs are performing. I wanted to quickly show how week 4 was. We know we saw some Retribution Paladin buffs. We saw some Destruction and Affliction Warlock buffs. We saw some Mage buffs. We generally saw some pretty nice changes overall that hopefully had some impact. So let's go from the week 4 rankings, as you can see them on screen here, to the now week 5. And thwabam, there we go. Here are the DPS rankings for week 5 across all specs, across Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. The Mythic Plus is scored on completion, overall score. So it's just how well they're doing in Mythic Plus. And then Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid is DPS output, all percentiles for the last 2 weeks in those 2 difficulties. This is where they scale up. So let's talk about where things are and where we're at. The first thing that stands out to me right away is how high Retribution Paladin went after the buffs in Mythic Raid only. They didn't really see too much adjustment going into normal, like Mythic Plus or Heroic Raid, but in Mythic Raid, the buffs that were applied gave Ret an amazing week of performance this week in Mythic Raid difficulty. They got I think they got 2 of their core abilities buffed, and then they got their Final Judgment buffed by a lot. So their damage output was increased quite significantly if played well, and obviously that shows in the Mythic Raid overall. Outlaw, Rogue, and Subtlety Rogue are still at the top overall when you put all of the different categories together. Not too surprising, Subtlety didn't see any changes, and Outlaw had one specific change that realistically wasn't going to do much at all, but that change went live and it didn't do anything at all. So Outlaw is still by far the best spec in Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. Subtlety is the second best in Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. Now, when we go into Heroic Raid, where difficulty doesn't matter, I like including Heroic Raid for that reason, and that there's nothing about Heroic Raid that forces any spec to do anything but their absolute best, right? The mechanics are very forgiving. The group size can be very variable. You can stack things, you can cheat parses. So I like to think of it as like, if they're just left alone to their own devices and they can do whatever they want, what do they parse with? How do they perform? And Assassination actually does quite well in Heroic Raid. In Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, they do extremely poorly comparatively, but it is kind of interesting to see how that stacks up. The third slot goes to Arcane Mage, mostly because of their Mythic Plus performance and partly their Heroic Raid performance. But Mythic Plus, Arcane is the third DPS underneath Subtlety and Outlaw. They're doing incredibly well, and they are very sought after in all Mythic Plus. What is cool about this, we've seen balance come up a little bit as well across the board. You can see in Mythic Plus scaling up about the same in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid, which is interesting because then that kind of tells you that in general, the difficulty and group size changes don't really seem to have much effect on balanced druids and their overall ranking relative to others. Underneath Arcane Mage for the overall ranking is Windwalker. Windwalker 4th in Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. They fall down a bit in Heroic, partially I think because of the skill ceiling and using all the abilities quickly and effectively and maintaining that over a long, 4 to 10 minute boss fight. But Windwalker overall doing well. Balance in the 5th spot here, primarily because of their Mythic Plus score, and then they're just above average in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. Unholy DK has been holding their upsurge. We saw them jump a bunch over the last couple weeks, and they've been kind of holding on to that. Still not the overall best, but they've earned the top 6 slot in the overall. After Unholy, we have Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman was higher at the very start of the X-Pack. At start of Season 1, Enhancement was a little bit higher. And then they crept down a little bit. They were pushed out by marksmanship. They were kind of pushed down, and then they've been slowly fighting their way back. Now, historically, enhancement always does better with better gear. They're very haste reliant. They're very stat weight reliant. So as they get better gear and they can stack those up more and more, they do better and better. They dropped down a little bit in Mythic Plus, but they're still doing excellent in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid. Underneath enhancement is Havoc Demon Hunter, taking the 4th slot this week in Mythic Raid overall. Actually insane. They were, again, just like Enhancement Shaman, higher at the start of the season. They fell down and they've been kind of creeping their way back up. You can see that when left to their own devices in Heroic, they just kind of get outscaled by some of the other classes that when they're left alone, they can do a lot more. But when pressure's on and they need to be consistent, Havoc can be incredibly consistent. And they had an amazing performance this week in Mythic Raid. Underneath Havoc is Marksmanship, which has been falling down. They took a 3% damage nerf a few weeks ago, and they've been falling down since then. They have some relatively big changes coming in 10.0.5, which we know is confirmed for January 24th. So just over a week now, we're going to be getting that big change. So all of these are going to get shifted, I would imagine, based on all the changes and reworks that are coming out. But they're still holding on to good performance, mostly because of their Mythic Plus overall scoring. They still do great there. Not as good as some of the other specs, but still in the top 3rd, which is amazing. They've been dropping pretty steadily in Mythic Raid, though, and we'll see how that goes going into 10.0.5. Underneath Marksmanship is Demonology. Demonology has actually started much higher in the initial scorings for launch of the X-Pack and in Season 1. They still do amazing in Mythic Plus, but they've been slowly pushed down by some of these gear-dependent classes that are kind of pushing up on them over time. So we're slowly seeing them creep down. And then underneath Demonology is Shadow Priest. So Shadow Priest overall, because they're so consistent, they're like middle of the pack in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid, and they're above the middle with Mythic Plus. They just got a nice buff, and they're going to get some more changes going into 10.0.5 as well. So Shadow Priest, also another gear-dependent class. The more stats they have, the better they can do, the more rotations they can get through, and they can start changing up how their specs work either way. So it's nice for them to be able to go further and further into the season. If you're playing a Shadow Priest, things are only looking good for you. Underneath Shadow is Feral Druid. They do much, much better when the difficulty is higher. You can see they're in the bottom 4 for Heroic Raid. Part of that is skill floor. I would say Feral has a higher than average skill floor, so you can definitely gear out a Feral Druid, not know much about it and jump in and play, but you're not going to do as well as some of the other classes that are a little more straightforward, where you're not managing your bleeds and getting your energy right and all that. But when played properly and optimally, they do exceptionally well in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, about average in Mythic Plus, and maybe top 3rd for Mythic Raid. Underneath Feral is Devastation. So they saw some love going into this last reset. They definitely needed it. They were basically middle of the pack in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. They dropped a little bit in Mythic Plus, but they jumped up a good bit in Mythic Raid. It could just be that more people are testing it out, but they got some damage buffs. They're going to get some more changes going into 10.0.5. But it's nice to see Devastation doing much better in Mythic Raid, that fixed group size. They've seen, like, I think the last 3 balance changes, Devastation has gotten a buff. So they've been kind of stacking that on top of each other. Underneath the Devastation is Assassination Rogue, and it's primarily just because of how well they do in Heroic Raid. They're parse monsters when difficulty isn't a concern. So if all you do is try to get ahead of the curve and you do Heroic Raid or normal raids with your guild, assassination it up. You can parse like an outlandish monster with Assassination. When difficulty gets higher and you actually have to do mechanics regularly and have to keep yourself alive and keep up with other classes, Assassination does quite poorly and does quite poorly in Mythic Plus. But normal and Heroic Raids, if you leave them alone, they do amazingly. So the damage possibility is there. Arms Warrior is underneath Assassination. Warriors have been falling down slowly. Fury fell down hard. Fury was actually in I believe, the top 6 of DPS overall for the start of the X-Pack, and stayed in like top 6, top 7 for the start of Season 1. Now that we're 5 weeks in, Fury has just been sliding down and down and down and down. Arms, after some nice buffs and some nice changes that they got to Mortal Strike and some other abilities, they've been climbing up above Fury, and they're about average right now. When it comes to Mythic Plus, Fury is superior and is comparable to like the new Destruction Warlock, but that's kind of where they're at right now. Underneath the Arms Warrior is Ret Paladin, who has come up a significant amount. In Mythic Plus, they can't keep up as well as some of the other classes, even losing out to the likes of Devastation with the changes and everything. But it's kind of encouraging to see Mythic Raid, more Ret Paladins being brought, and when played optimally to the highest level, Ret still has that crazy damage output, and we'll see kind of if that carries forward. But right now, I think in normal content, if you're looking at this and saying, should I be a Ret Paladin, should I not? If you're playing, average keys, like you're just doing like ahead of the curve, and you're just doing your Keystone Master, Ret is definitely in the bottom third. They struggle a bit, but that skill ceiling and damage ceiling is there. If you can optimize and min-max everything and play everything properly and never miss a global, the Ret Paladin burst is still very much alive. It's just harder to get to. Underneath Ret Paladin is the Fury Warrior, fallen down quite a lot overall. They still do, like I said, they still do okay in Mythic Plus, but they've fallen a lot in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. Underneath Fury is Frost DK, which has come up a lot. They used to be in the gutter. They were real struggling. Frost DK has been coming up. They didn't have a big resurgence like Unholy did, but they are doing better and better in difficult content. Still parsing quite poorly in Heroic Raid, but and then they're just being left behind in favor of Unholy in Mythic Plus. But in Mythic Raid, they are starting to show some numbers. So we'll see how this goes as we go into the next patch, and we see some more updates coming in. Elemental Shaman has been struggle busing. This one is kind of shocking for me because Elemental was doing about average. So you can see that they're dropping down from that average mark. Part of that's from, classes coming up. They got some nice buffs. And also kind of like Enhancement, Elemental does do well with gear, but it's the way I see this is it seems like that the value that Elemental is getting from getting more and more geared every week is starting to have serious diminishing returns and starting to fall off. So it could be that their kit or their overall damage throughput is lacking, and that more gear isn't going to fix Elemental. They started out great, but as the season has gone on, they have not been keeping up with the increase in power that everyone else has had. Another, right after Elemental, we have Destruction Warlock, which is another really exciting opportunity here. Destruction and Affliction. Actually, Destruction was the very bottom of all 3 categories last week. They got some nice buffs coming into this week. Affliction did as well. So they've come up off the bottom when it comes to Mythic Plus. So they still suck in Raid, unfortunately. They've been doing really poorly in Raid ever since the start of the X-Pack. That has not changed, but the buffs that they received seem to have a very major impact on their performance in Mythic Plus. So more AoE cleave, more ability to kind of get through mobs and keep up. So they're actually just about middle. They're scoring almost the same as Fury Warriors and Elemental Shamans in Mythic Plus, which is encouraging. They're not doing super great in Mythic and Heroic, but it's nice to see not, the Destruction and Affliction specs for Warlock at the bottom of every category after those changes. So obviously those had a nice impact for them. Beast Mastery is right after Destruction on the list, falling down even more. They are just not scaling that well, my friends. In pre-patch, before the expansion went out, they were like in the top 3. The first week of the expansion, they were in like top 3, top 4, and they've just been nose bombing all the way down. They do okay in like AOTC style content, Heroic Raid, where difficulty and mechanics don't really affect your performance all that much. They do okay, but when the difficulty scales up and they have to keep up with their classes, just like Assassination, they struggle quite a lot. So if you're trying to do cutting edge content, you're better off playing marksmanship. But if you're just playing with your friends and you're doing, Keystone Master, AOTC, and below, Beast Mastery does just fine. Just fine overall. Affliction is just after Beast Mastery, and this is because in Heroic Raid, they're starting to parse. So this is encouraging. It's not, a saving grace, but it's encouraging because in Mythic Raid, they're still the bottom. In Mythic Plus, they're second to the bottom, just on top of Survival. But when they're left alone and they can dot everything up and use all that and free cast and mechanics aren't really a huge obstacle, they can parse. So that's encouraging. They couldn't do that before. Obviously, there's other things that they need to be able to do. Maybe they can't switch targets with the dots as easily, or they can't access their DPS as much, or maybe they just have some other issues going on. But they are at least starting to parse in non-challenge content like Heroic Raid. So that is encouraging. They did get some buffs, and we'll see if that starts to climb up more and more. Survival Hunter is right after Affliction. They are the very bottom in Mythic Plus. They are the worst DPS to bring to Mythic Plus as of week 5. They are in the bottom 5 for Mythic Raid, so not doing as well there either. And they don't parse that well either. In Heroic Raid, left alone, they do okay. They're kind of in that bottom cohort, not as bad as Destruction, Fire, or Frost Mage, but they still don't have the output that you would like to see, I think, from that DPS spec. Then at the very bottom of overall is Fire and Frost Mage. So they got another round of buffs. They're getting more are coming, but they're still not there. Left alone to their own devices in Heroic Raid, they don't parse. The damage just isn't there. In Mythic Raid, when you're talking about the best players doing everything they possibly can in a fixed group size to parse, they still can't really reach it. And the same thing goes for Mythic Plus. So you can kind of see that there. Interesting to see Arcane drop down in Mythic Raid over the last week, partially just because of other classes jumping up, but also maybe because they just missed that. But this is the overall scoring for week 5 DPS Dragonflight. Let me know what you think down below on where things stand relative to last week and what you expect these numbers to change going into 10.0.5, which we're just about a week away from. So it's not next reset, but it's the reset after. So we're kind of we're getting real close to that. So it's gonna be really exciting to see how all these shift, how all the reworks happen. I'll start working on the tank and the healer rankings, so look out for those videos coming very soon. And that's it. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.